I guess you never really know who your neighbors are until they decide they own the dirt you're standing on. And for me, that realization didn't come with a polite knock or a welcome wagon. It came with the sound of a heavy boot splintering my front door at 7 in the morning. My name is Elena Vance, and I live in a quiet, windswept corner of the Pacific Northwest where the pines are thick and the secrets are usually thicker, but I never expected the local homeowners association to turn into a paramilitary squad overnight. I spent 6 years as a combat medic, and Afghanistan took a lot from me. Specifically the use of my legs after a roadside IED turned my Humvee into a heap of scrap metal, but it didn't take my spine, and it sure as hell didn't take my family. That morning started out like any other, the smell of fresh ground coffee filling the kitchen and the low, comforting rumble of my twin brothers, Jax and Silas, arguing over who was better at grilling a medium-rare steak when this voice, this deep, artificial, and quote, I'm in charge here, and quote, kind of voice, just ripped through the silence. End quote. HOA enforcement, open up now. End quote. It barked, and I remember looking at my brothers, who are both active-duty Navy SEALs home on a rare 2-week leave, and seeing their expressions shift from goofy siblings to stone-cold professionals in about half a second. Outside on my porch stood 3 guys in these crisp, navy blue tactical jackets with, end quote, HOA enforcement, end quote, plastered across the back in big, white, aggressive block letters. And they weren't carrying clipboards or violation notices. They were carrying short-barreled rifles slung across their chests like they were about to clear a compound in Kandahar. I rolled my chair toward the window, my heart doing that slow, heavy thud it only does when I smell trouble, and I saw their mirrored sunglasses reflecting the morning sun, hiding eyes that were looking for a fight, not a conversation. They started banging again, the kind of bang that makes the glass rattle in the frames, and they shouted about, in quote, unauthorized modifications, in quote, and in quote, long-term compliance issues, in quote, which was funny because I lived there for 8 years and never missed a payment. Jax moved toward the door, his movements fluid and scary quiet, while Silas stayed near me, his hand instinctively hovering over the kitchen counter where he'd laid his pocket knife earlier, and they both looked at me, waiting for my lead. I told them to stay back, not because I was scared for them, but because I knew what they were capable of, and I didn't end oppos, 2 on my living room floor covered in the blood of some local bullies if I could help it. End quote. Identify yourselves, end quote. I yelled through the wood, my voice steady despite the adrenaline, end quote. Give me names, badge numbers, and the name of the HOA president who authorized this, end quote. But there was no answer, just the distinct metallic click of a rifle safety being flicked off, and that's when the world slowed down. One of them chuckled a low, nasty sound and said, end quote, we're the law in this zip code, sweetheart, and your grace period just expired, end quote, before the door frame literally exploded inward. The deadbolt didn't end oppos. T just give way. It shattered the wood, and suddenly these 3 silhouettes were standing in my foyer, their boots tracking mud onto my rug, their rifles held at a low ready, and I could smell the gun oil and the cheap cologne on the lead guy, a barrel-chested dude with a shaved head who looked like he'd been kicked out of every police academy in the state. Jax didn't end oppos. To even yell, he just stepped into the light, all 6'3" of him, looking like a mountain that had decided to move, and he said, end quote, wrong house, boys, end quote, with a tone so cold it could have frozen the coffee right in the pot. The lead guy, Len Oppos, as Colin Miller, smirked like he was the big man on campus, telling us about trash cans being left out for an extra 3 hours and my wheelchair ramp being, end quote, non-compliant, end quote, with the aesthetic of the neighborhood, which is a load of crap because the ramp had been approved years ago. He looked at me in my chair, his eyes traveling down to my legs with this pitying, condescending sneer, and he said, end quote, maybe if you spent less time playing the victim and more time reading the bylaws, we wouldn't end oppos. T have to be here, end quote. And I felt Silas's energy shift behind me, a predatory stillness that usually means someone is about to go to the hospital. But my brothers are smart. They're not just brawn, they're tacticians, and I saw them exchanging those silent, twin looks, the ones where they communicate entire battle plans without saying a word, and they began subtly positioning themselves. They were funneling these guys, moving them away from the open door and into the narrow part of the living room where their rifles would be useless in a scuffle, but the, end quote, enforcers, end quote, were too arrogant to notice they were being hunted in a room they thought they'd conquered. End quote. I'm giving you 5 seconds to walk out of here and another 10 to get off my property before I call the county sheriff, end quote. I said, my hand on the armrest of my chair, but Miller just laughed again and said the sheriff didn't and oppose. T have jurisdiction over private HOA contracts. He was lying, of course, but it showed me just how deep the rot went. This wasn't an oppose. T about grass height. This was about a group of guys who had been given a little bit of power and a lot of ego by a corrupt board that wanted to drive certain people out of the neighborhood. Jax took a slow step forward, his voice dropping an octave into that, end quote, professional, end quote, range that usually precedes a disaster, and he told them, end quote, you're standing a house with 2 SEALs and a decorated combat medic, and you just broke down our door. Now, what do you think happens next? End quote. You could see the flicker of doubt in the eyes of the younger guy in the back, his grip on his rifle tightening until his knuckles turned white, and suddenly there, end quote, enforcement, end quote. Mission didn't and oppose. T feels so much like a walk in the park. The tension was so thick you could have cut it with a bayonet, and then, as if on cue, an SUV revved its engine out in the driveway, a short, sharp burst of sound that seemed like a signal from their backup. Miller looked at his guys, then back at Jax, trying to keep his, end quote, tough guy, end quote, mask on, but the sweat was starting to bead on his forehead, and he muttered something about, end quote, coming back with more paperwork, end quote, before they backed out of the hole where my door used to be. We watched from the window as they piled into a blacked-out SUV with no plates, followed by a silver sedan that had been idling across the street. A lookout, and as they drove off, Silas pulled out his phone, having already snapped photos of every face and every detail. End quote. They and oppos, Renod HOA, Elena, end quote. Silas said, his brow furrowing as he looked at the zoomed-in photos, end quote. Look at the stitching on those jackets, the way they hold those weapons. They're private security, probably mercenaries for hire, and they're definitely not here for the landscaping, end quote. We didn't oppose. T just sit around and wait for round 2. We spent the next 4 hours turning my home into a literal kill box, though Jax preferred the term, end quote, defensive perimeter, end quote. While I sat on my laptop hacking, well, let's say politely navigating the county property records and the HOA's digital filing system, my brothers were digging through their old gear bag from the trunk of their car. They pulled out things the Navy definitely didn't and oppose. T intend for them to keep. Portable signal jammers, high-resolution thermal drones, and enough tactical sensors to monitor a small village. I found the link. The HOA board had been taken over 6 months ago by a real estate development firm that wanted to bulldoze our street to build a luxury high-rise complex, but they couldn't and oppose. T do it as long as, end quote. Legacy owners, end quote. Like me, were still holding our deeds. They weren't and oppose. T trying to enforce rules. They were trying to break us, targeting the, end quote. Vulnerable, end quote. One's first, me, Mrs. Gable down the street, who's 80 and lives alone, and the Henderson family who are currently dealing with a sick kid. End quote. They and oppose. Coming back tonight, end quote. Jack said, his voice flat as he watched the drone feed on his tablet, showing the black SUV parked 3 blocks away in a hidden cul-de-sac. End quote. They think they scared us, but more importantly, they think they know the layout of the house now. End quote. Silas grinned, that wolfish, seal grin that usually means someone's about to have the worst night of their life. And he replied, end quote, let them come. They're expecting a disabled woman and 2 brothers who talk big, so let's give them a welcome they can't put in a report. End quote. We spent the evening in silence, the air heavy with the scent of gun oil, as the twins prepped, and I watched them string invisible tripwires at shin height across the porch and install pinhole cameras in the eaves. It was surreal, sitting in the home I'd bought with my disability settlement, watching it be turned into a tactical objective, but for the first time since the explosion in Afghanistan, I didn't and oppose. T feel like a victim. I felt like the bait in a very, very dangerous trap. When the sun went down, the neighborhood turned into a graveyard, the streetlights flickering over the empty asphalt, and we sat in the dark living room with only one small lamp on to act as a, end quote, lure, end quote. At exactly 11:14 p.m., the thermal sensors on Jax's tablets started chirping. 6 heat signatures moving through the woods behind my house, skipping the front door this time and heading for the back deck. They were using night vision, or so they thought, but Silas had already activated the infrared floodlights that would wash out any cheap civilian NVEGs they were wearing, turning their world into a blinding white blur the second they stepped onto the porch. We heard the soft clink of a lockpick, then the stumble as the first guy hit the tripwire, followed by a muffled curse that was cut short by the sound of a heavy body hitting the deck boards. The signal jammer was already humming, killing their radios and their cell signals. So when they realized they were in trouble, they cooed into Oppos. T even screamed for help to the guy in the SUV. It wasn't an Oppos, a fight. It was a professional dismantling. Jax and Silas moved through the house like smoke, disappearing into the shadows and reappearing behind these, enforcers, who were suddenly realizing they weren't into Oppos, the apex predators anymore. I watched on the monitor as one guy got yanked into the laundry room so fast he didn't into Oppos, even have time to drop his flashlight, and another was pinned against the kitchen wall by Silas, who whispered something in his ear that made the guy's eyes go wide with pure, unadulterated terror. They weren't in Oppos, tough guys. They were bullies who had never been punched back, and once they lost their tactical advantage in their ability to communicate, they folded like wet cardboard. We ended up with all 6 of them lined up on my back patio, zip-tied and stripped of their fancy jackets, looking a lot less intimidating in their undershirts while the drizzling rain started to soak into their boots. I rolled my chair out onto the deck, the light from the kitchen casting a long shadow over them. And I looked Miller, the leader from the morning, right in his shivering eyes. You said you were the law, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet night, But it turns out the law doesn't in Oppos. Like it when you impersonate officers, break into private residences, and try to extort veterans out of their homes, I held up a folder full of the documents I printed out, the proof of the developers' kickbacks to the HOA board, the illegal enforcement contracts, and the list of other neighbors they'd been harassing. Miller tried to spit at me, but Jax just shifted his weight slightly, and the guy flinched so hard he almost tipped over, proving that bullies are only brave when the other person can in Oppos. Fight back. We didn't in Oppos. Called the local police first. We called a friend of mine in the state attorney's office and a local news reporter who had been itching for a story on HOA corruption, and by the time the sun started to peek over the pines, my driveway was full of blue lights and cameras. The fallout was massive. The HOA board was dissolved within a week. 3 members of the development firm were indicted for racketeering, and Miller and his enforcement squad are currently facing a laundry list of felony charges that'll keep them off any porch for a long, long time. But as I sit here now, looking at my new, reinforced front door and watching Jax and Silas pack their bags to head back to base, I can't end Oppos. Help but wonder how many other Elena Van Cess are out there right now, sitting in their homes and feeling terrified because some board with a little bit of power decided they didn't end Oppos. Belong. The neighborhood is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet. The neighbors actually talk to each other now, and Mrs. Gable even brought over a pie to thank my brothers for, taking out the trash, my brothers saved my house, sure, but they also reminded me that being in this chair doesn't end Oppos. Mean I'm out of the fight. It just means I have a different vantage point. So, I have to ask you guys, because I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Where's the line? When does a community organization turn into a gang? And why do we give people so much power over our own homes just because they have a title like, president, or, enforcer, Have you ever dealt with an HOA that went off the rails? Or seen a situation where someone tried to bully a neighbor because they thought they were an easy target? I want to hear your stories in the comments, because honestly, I think the only way to stop people like Miller is to shine a light on them until they have nowhere left to hide. Did we go too far by setting a trap? Or was it the only way to handle a group that didn't end Oppos? To respect the law in the first place? Len Oppos, let's talk about it, because I have a feeling my neighborhood ISN into Oppos. The only one with monsters hiding behind a code of, compliant, paint.